Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and everyone at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Robert Jones Jr. to celebrate his masterful new novel, The Prophets, published by Putnam. Robert Jones Jr. was born and raised in New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing with honors and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He's the creator of the social justice social media community, Son of Baldwin, and The Prophets is his debut novel. I can't say enough great things about this book. I read it in galley form last year during an entire weekend without stop and knew that I was encountering something I had never read before and that I was having an historic reading experience. Robert has quoted Toni Morrison saying, "If you can't find the book you want to read, you have to write it." And that's exactly what Robert has done. I have goosebumps. He's given us something extraordinary, and I'm just thrilled that he's with us tonight to talk more about it. And he'll be talking with the brilliant Deesha Philyaw, whose own debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, was nominated for a National Book Award and took the world by storm last year. Deesha's writing on race, parenting, gender, and culture has appeared in many publications. Throughout this evening's broadcast, please feel free to post your questions in the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we're going to keep the chat on so you can chat with us there. If you don't already have your copy of The Prophets, this is my galley, please press the green button at the bottom of the screen, and believe me, you want this book. Every purchase you make helps keep Books and Books up and running. So we thank you for your support and all of your donations. We're going to start the program with a short reading by Robert, and then Deesha will join him for the conversation. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Robert Jones Jr. to the virtual stage. Hi, Robert.
Hi, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you everybody for coming. I know your lives are busy. Thank you for making time for the arts. I am going to read from a chapter titled Isaiah toward the end of the book. Please enjoy. Be a stone. Please be a stone. That was what some rocks said to some feathers, to the dandelion wishes that floated about minding their own business before coming down slowly to land in some meadow and, after a time, take root. They wanted soft things to harden for their own good, but that left no consideration for the traveler who had to walk barefoot over the terrain, left them no comfortable place to step. And Isaiah wanted to be that for Samuel. But comfort for travelers wasn't the point, because wonderful for them that they had some place to rest their feet, weary as they might be, but what about all the soft things beneath them? Yes, I know, but I can't be what I want to be. Open fields then, where the blues were heartbreak and the black-eyed Susans were high in their conceit. Isaiah laid down both sword and shield way before he even got to the river. Whatever was ahead would be the hell Tubal feared, unless it also came with a promise. The tip of Isaiah's trembling tongue at the edge of Isaiah's impatient nipple. That was the thing that made the head roll back and the face worship sky. That was the thing to unfurl itself, a delicate bloom holding onto dew like joy. That was the thing to cause many waters to rush toward calm and therefore to harbor. Yes, that was the thing. And all the while he babbled in their covered intimacies, making Samuel ask him why he liked to talk so much. Where was the quiet? And could they have it for themselves if just for a time? Sleep is quiet enough, Isaiah had told him. When we awake, I want to make sure you hear me. Inside you, I want you to hear me. Samuel looked away. He understood it, but he couldn't hold it. Elusive, like trying to catch a wish when a stone was easier to grasp. But Isaiah couldn't be a stone, especially not now, unless he wanted to sink to the bottom deep. I'd be your stone for you. How would Samuel get across the river with that weight on him? He too had nearly succumbed. No one would ever know how close he came to betraying everything, even himself, in exchange for a tender name. Why they hate us? The answer plumb right in front of you, Zay, because Amos told them to, and Massa told Amos to. They could deal with the stares and the whispers, but the cleaving? That was what pushed Isaiah into the night waters, where who knows what was liable to have at him. No, he couldn't be a sinking stone, for he needed now to float. Nameless, because Isaiah wasn't the name given to him by those who he truly belonged to. Thus he walked about wearing an insult like cast-offs. He answered to disrespect every time he was called, whether the caller adored him or not. Yes, indeed, nearly a stone. He took all of that, every single piece of that, and carried it on his back when he shot into the dark water, not knowing what abyss could be below. They had said that his people were afraid of water and couldn't swim. He had heard stories of elders who leaped into the sea rather than to make it to these bitter shores, and how easy they went down. He thought maybe it was true then, that his people were made of stones, and the minute he thought he would make it across, he would sink to the bottom and drown. He took a deep breath before he disappeared below the surface. Sound became muffled, bubbles bursting and water rushing into his every space. His eyes were squeezed shut. He opened them and it made no difference. Everything was black, and maybe that was a good thing.
Hey.
Hi, Deesha.
Give me a minute. Give me a minute. Give me a minute. I read it. I don't think I've heard you read. And so I need a minute. That was beautiful and
Thank you
aching,
so much.
like the book itself.
Thank you.
And I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. Um, I want to first ask you this question. How are you doing? We got to check on each other. That's the first question.
Have mercy. For y'all, for those of you who don't know, Deesha Philyaw is my cousin, like my claimed cousin. We not cousins by blood, but we are cousins by spirit, and we check in on each other every now and again. Doing this art, which is activism at the same time, because we are Black writing in a space that does not want to hear us. So having Deesha here is very special to me, and I'm so glad she is here. And cousin Deesha, I'm doing okay. I watched the inauguration. I watched that young sister in her glorious melanin read that poem.
Yes.
I saw
In that yellow.
listen, I saw the forever First Lady Michelle Obama give you magenta realness with the
Yes.
gold belt.
Yes.
But
Slaying.
I'm still a little unsettled by this country. The fact that 74 million people voted to keep me oppressed, to keep you oppressed, that they stormed the Capitol for on behalf of evil, not even on behalf of good, not on behalf of liberation or freedom, but the right to oppress others. That's troubling. And what I also find troubling is the calls upon Black people, Black communities to break bread with these people who would rather than shake our hand, want to put their hands around our necks. So I'm okay, but I'm weary.
And it's an old story. We know, it's always been demanded of Black people that we be more respectable and more civil than people who would seek to destroy us. So we know that story. We know that narrative. Um, so let's talk about your narratives in the prophets. I am in awe of this book, and I am thankful for this book. I am in awe of you, and I am thankful for you. We could talk for hours. As you know, there was so much I wanted to say and ask, and we have our lifetimes to do that. But I did make a few notes, few things I wanted to make sure that I got to. Um, as you know, in Beloved, Toni Morrison wrote, "Freeing yourself was one thing, claiming ownership of that freed self was another." And this idea of claiming, reclaiming, owning the self, we know goes throughout her body of work, but in particular with Beloved and for our enslaved ancestors and formerly enslaved ancestors. And in the prophets, you gave us that same kind of gift with a view into our ancestors' interior lives. So deeply. In particular, with the prophets, you show us Black intimacies. And I stole that phrase from our friend Kiese. He used that phrase to talk about my book. And I'm like, that's what it is. It's Black intimacies. And that's a big phrase. And you parse it out, right? So of course there is the sexual intimacy. There's tenderness, there's the dignity, there's the fierce intellect of our ancestors, there's the connection to spirit. And yes, there's the cruelty. Auntie said, beat down people did beat down things. And I had to sit with that. So you gave us this fullness. But above all, what you showed us was the love. Mm-hmm. And I came to the prophets, reading the jacket cover, expecting a love story, but there were multiple love stories. There was so much longing and loss, and I wasn't ready for it. It brought me up short. It brought me to tears many times as I read. So with all of that said, where did this story come from?
This story came from the lack of one. When I was in undergrad, I was an Africana Studies minor, and I read so many glorious works by so many glorious Black authors, and kept running up against the fact that prior to the Harlem Renaissance, I could not find any evidence of any Black queer figures. And so I went searching, and all I could find were, when I found Blackness and queerness at the intersection, it was always in the context of sexual assault or rape, whether the queer person was a victim or a perpetrator. And I thought, okay, but what about love? And so, because our dear Morrison said, if you cannot find the book you wish to read, you must write it, I told myself, okay, I'm going to try to write this. And I was afraid because there was no template. There was no story like this being told. There were no Black queer figures during antebellum slavery in the literary canon that I could find. And I had to reckon with also the idea that queerness as we know it didn't exist then. Now, what I want to make clear is I'm not saying that queer people didn't exist. I'm saying we didn't call it that. And there's also some debate about whether or not same gender, same sex loving people would have known their identity as such. My argument is no one had to tell me that I was queer before I knew it myself. I didn't know it was called queer, but I knew that my heart feelings went toward boys and men. No one had to tell me that there was a word for that. It already existed in me intrinsically. And often the heterosexist gaze imagines that homosexuality comes out of some sort of trauma or some kind of defect. that it is not something that
Right.
springs up out of nature, inside, intrinsic to your DNA being in blood. So when I remembered that that's the case, it became a little bit easier to imagine this story. But it still took me 14 years to write.
Yeah. Because beyond that queer love story, or what we would call a queer love story, there's a community. And so in 14 years, you built that community. And there's this multiplicity of voices, ancestor voices, there's voices across continents, voices across centuries. And I love hearing us so fully in ways that I never heard us before in your pages. And they're very distinct. They are simultaneously of their time, but also timeless. So can you talk about voice and how you approach that in this with such a huge cast of characters?
And I'm thinking about the sisters in The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, and how they're all they're related, and they're all very distinct as they choose one of them to write a letter to the sister they haven't met yet. I'm thinking about that as well, because I think in some ways our books are in conversation in these really interesting ways. But how the voices came to me were, I initially started writing this book solely from Samuel's point of view, but it was leaving out so much information that needed to be communicated. So I said, okay, well, maybe I'll tell it from Samuel and Isaiah's point of view, that, they're the two main characters, they get to talk. But even then, it wasn't enough. And I said, okay, here's this problem. The problem is that what's at the core of this story is their love. And what that love requires is witnesses. And so I then began to develop the other characters around them to say, listen, this is what I love about Samuel and Isaiah. This is what inspires me about Samuel and Isaiah. This is what I hate about them. This is what I want to destroy about them. And from there, the characters then drove the structure. The structure was driving the plot. And I was trying to figure out a way to make this all sound cohesive. So I returned to some works by Toni Morrison, like Paradise, to see how she accomplished it. I went to the 12 Tribes of Hattie by Ayanna Mathis to see how she accomplished it. And then I started on my path. And then one night, in the middle of a dream, I woke up, a phrase came to me, I scribbled it down in the dark, came back to it the next morning, and it said, "You do not yet know us." And I interpreted that as the ancestors saying that they too needed a voice in this narrative, because they wanted to talk to me, they wanted to talk to these characters, they wanted to talk to the reader. And so I let them come in, and they led me actually across the Atlantic back over to the continent to incorporate some of the African stories into this too. And that is how it all started to come together.
Okay. So we talked about Morrison. Let's talk about Baldwin. He said, "Artists are here to disturb the peace. And what peace do you hope to disrupt with the prophets?"
Woo! All the pieces. But in particular, in particular, I'm looking to disturb the one that says harm toward Black people is okay. It is natural to want to harm Black people, that we can base entire societies around Black harm, where walking down the street with this skin on means a license to kill me. I'm trying to interrupt that by getting Americans to do something that Americans don't do, which is look at themselves. Another thing that Baldwin said was that Americans love to be innocent, and their innocence is the crime.
Come on. Come on.
And I'm trying to get...
Come on. With the myth of white innocence. Yes.
Listen, so what I'm trying to do with the prophets is to um, sort of reinvest the Black queer figure with the kind of humanity that was stripped away by ignoring and erasing Black queer figures from the historical and cultural narrative, but at the same time, let all the readers know this is ridiculous for me to have to say, but we are people. And when you do the things that you do to us, it's your humanity that's diminished, not mine. And hopefully when you read this book, you'll come away with that. And maybe it can make, if it could change one person's mind, hopefully it has done something.
And for those of us who are Black reading this book, what do you hope we take away?
Our glory. We need to understand that we come from a long line of people who survived, and how they survived was because they held on to each other. They didn't let these little things come in between each other. They held on to our spirituality and our traditions in a way that unified us, not in a way that divided us. So when you have these evangelical Christians who hold dogmatically onto Christianity in the way that diminishes women, diminishes queer people, diminishes trans people, diminishes disabled people, let that go, because that is not our tradition. We learned that from the oppressor, and we're claiming it as ours, but it's not ours. Let it go.
That's right. That was a word. So you got me thinking of something I was going to ask a little bit later, but this, to me, The Prophets, to me, reads like a deeply feminist novel.
Oh.
And again, Samuel and Isaiah are, the other characters are in many ways in their orbit. But you do what I feel is necessary whenever we are critiquing or showing white supremacy to itself. You can't do a complete job of that without bringing misogyny to the fore, without looking at patriarchy. And some people will want to talk about white supremacy, but not misogyny and patriarchy. So my heart was glad to see that you, not only that you did it, but how you did it. You did it through Maggie. You did it through so many of the women and their observations and their experiences of men. That again, it was so unexpected for me, but so welcome. It is the women in the story that have blood memory, and their voices are centered and powerful, and just straight no chaser. Like this, this was 1850 whatever, but I felt like this was me and my friends, my crew. The way that the sharp observations, all of that. Can you talk about those voices and also just how you approached the commentary that you did around patriarchy and misogyny?
Yes, it was really important for me, and something that I set out to do from the onset was ensure that I didn't replicate that error of erasing Black women out of this discussion. We so often go to Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, and so on and so forth, when we're having these discussions about Black agency and sort of our fight against white supremacy going back to antebellum slavery till now. I said, nah, because there is a Harriet Tubman, and her story matters just as much, if not more. So if I'm gonna talk about this time period, there's no way I can do it without remembering the Black women who sacrificed in very particular ways so that I can be here. And you were saying how you got a sort of a modern sensibility out of how these characters, these Black women characters. And the truth of the matter is, I was going to like my great grandmother and finding out what her story was. And it turns out that these issues are from all the way back, that Black women always had to deal with this dual thing of racism and sexism combined from white people, then come home and she's got to deal with the sexism at home with the man, and she could find no safe space except for in her sisters because they could relate. So if my great grandmother, who was born in 1901, felt this way, then I'm sure the women that were born just 30 years before her mother, probably felt the same way. So I knew that I wouldn't be stretching the truth or anything like that if I imbued these characters with that sensibility, that my own oral history told me that I had permission to do this.
Well, that was one of the it just felt not juicy. That's not the right word. I don't want to say juicy, but it was like a gift. Every page was a gift, and so unexpected, and that it felt like reading family. It did feel like reading family. So again, thank you for that. Which of the characters was the most difficult for you to sit with?
Paul, the plantation owner. It was really difficult to get into his mind to determine how he became a person that can look at another person and say, you're not human. And I can do the most wicked things to you and think that it's good. So Paul was the most difficult. So I had to meditate on Paul for a while. I had to rewrite his chapters more than any other chapter in this book. He had to get the most revisions because I kept saying, okay, I got to find the human being in here somewhere, because this is not a comic book. I'm not writing about heroes and villains. I got to figure out who he is. Right. I had to figure out who he is and what made him this way. So I went back to his childhood and understood, okay, this is why he's like this. This is why he thinks this is okay, because at some point in his life, he conflated love with accumulation, which many people do. And so I said, okay, that is the wall that comes up that can make somebody not see the humanity in somebody else. So then I got him, but it took a long time for me to get Paul.
And which character do you see yourself in the most?
Wow. That's a great question. I kind of see myself in three characters. I see myself sometimes in Samuel, sometimes in Isaiah, and sometimes in Sarah. Those three, if you put them all together and mixed them up and made them complicated, would probably be as close as you can get to me in terms of personality and my thoughts and feelings as possible. Samuel, because of his dogged determination to not be conquered by white supremacy. Isaiah, because of his determination to be as humane as he possibly can and not let those people turn him into something he's not. And Sarah, because don't test me.
See, I thought you were going to say Maggie for that reason, because when I read Maggie's first chapter, I was like, oh, I love her. I love her so much.
Everybody loves Maggie. Everyone's told me that Maggie's their favorite character.
Yeah. I mean, that, I mean, she literally sprang off the page, and she has forever changed my view. We tend to have that sepia tone view of the period of slavery and so forth, and who these women are. I mean, your whole book does that, but the character of Maggie was the first in the book to do that for me. And I was like, well, I got to buckle my seatbelt now, because this is about to be something that, you know, that I wasn't, again, I was not ready for a lot of this, but the way she resists, and her fierce, I said this earlier, her intellect, and her knowing, her very deep knowing, I was just blown away by that. So that would, I mean, there's so many wonderful chapters, but that's my favorite chapter, when we meet Maggie, actually. Anyway, what chapter was the most difficult for you to sit with?
Song of Songs, where Kosai is contemplating rebellion on the slave ship and dealing with the horrors of being chained up in this place where he doesn't understand the languages, the smell is making him gag, the darkness is not the kind of darkness he's accustomed to, and these people seem to him like demons made flesh. That was hard to write because my skin was hurting when I was writing it. Because you know how it is. These characters start to become you. They start to talk to you. They start to take over your life. They start to live with you. And so it was him in my ear constantly and telling me how horrible this was. And I was like, Kosai, okay. And it was just making me hurt. And that was probably the most difficult chapter for me to write.
Then I'm going to skip ahead, since you mentioned this. Reading this, that chapter and lots of moments in the prophets was incredibly difficult, and brought me to tears, as I said. And I know that you and I have talked about how writing about slavery takes its toll. How did meditation, you mentioned, how else did you take care of yourself during the process of writing and researching and then revising this book?
I took a lot of walks. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and Brooklyn is a beautiful city. I walked from Brooklyn to Queens and back. I went to parks. I went to the botanical gardens. I surrounded myself by nature. I visited my nieces, nephews, and nibblings because I needed a child's love to be around. The joy of children really helped me to come out of the muck, as it were, of slavery, to rinse myself of it. And like you said, I did a lot of meditation, talking to the ancestors, telling them to help me. Please help me tell your story in a way that's honest, in a way that I could survive intact. Because you survived for me. So let me survive so I can tell your story.
Okay. And you've also mentioned that you won't write about this again. No,
I can't. This was a one-shot deal. I was about to say Toni Morrison only wrote about it once, but actually A Mercy starts to go a little bit in that direction. So I don't want to say I'll never say never. But as of right now, it is not in me to write about this again. Although some people have asked me to write a sequel because they want to know more about Samuel and Isaiah. So
So we'll see.
We'll see.
So I asked you about the chapter that was most difficult for you to sit with. Do you have a favorite character or a favorite chapter?
My favorite character is King Akusa. And if I get to write a prequel or something of that related to the prophets, I want to write about her. I want to write about her growing up, what her life was like, all of that kind of stuff. She was my favorite character. She's the one that made me smile most. that impressed me most. I really, really enjoyed her. And as far as a favorite chapter, I think I really like Pua's chapter. I think is my favorite. Pua for me represents the Black girl that's allowed to be vulnerable. Because so often Black women are allowed strength, but not allowed vulnerability. So I wrote Pua with intention of allowing her vulnerabilities and allowing us to see what happens to her when those vulnerabilities are exploited or poked or touched, so that we can see what happens to her.
Yes.
And honestly, that is the reason why I wrote Isaiah too, because you often don't get to see Black men's vulnerabilities, and so I wanted to show a Black man being vulnerable too. But Pua is currently my favorite chapter because she's so whimsical and hopeful, but also so precious, and so I want to protect her. That's like my gut feeling. So yeah, I like Pua's chapter the best.
Yeah. And you're protective of her, and you show that vulnerability. But another thing that really struck me throughout the book was how unsentimental you were about children. That was so different, and I really was not expecting that. But I was like, this makes total sense. This absolutely makes sense. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but I want to tell you that when she goes to show how she got her hair plaited, and she goes to show Samuel and Isaiah, and she gets surprised, I felt that. I felt every bit of that moment. And so, you're capturing, just the tenderness and vulnerability of girlhood, all of that. So, yeah, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit about, what you hope different groups of people would get from the prophets. As you were writing, did you think, I'm writing this book for, and who was that, if you thought that?
I automatically knew from the jump that I was writing this book for other Black queer people, to let them know you are not unnatural. And whoever tells you that is a liar. You are as natural as the sun, as the moon, as the trees. You belong to the landscape. And of all the things that are happening around this book, the most precious thing that happened to me a couple of days ago, where a 19-year-old Black queer young man inboxed me on Instagram and said, "Mr. Jones, this was the book I was waiting for." That was the reason. That was the reason. And so when he said that, I said, okay, I've accomplished what I need to accomplish. Everything after this now is frosting and gravy, because that was the purpose.
Gravy. That's right. That's right. So speaking of young folks, if you had some advice to younger Robert, young writer Robert, 30 years ago, 25, 20 years ago, just getting started, what would that be?
Young Roberts, you are going to hear some obscene things about what it means to be Black and a writer. Do not believe it. Write anyway. That would be my advice to young Robert, because young Robert heard a great deal that being Black and being a writer was a bad thing, that those two words were incompatible, that in order to be the second thing, the first thing had to be erased. No. What I discovered is that with the first thing, the second thing is given more dimension. So if I erased that first part, the second part would have been meaningless. I claim Black writer, as Morrison before me claimed it, as a badge of honor. I am writing in a tradition that started where our earliest ancestors were forbidden from reading and writing by law and could be killed for doing so. So when you call me a Black writer and think it's an insult, that's the highest compliment you can pay me.
I shared recently on Twitter that 1973 book review of Sula, where that white, and that's exactly what she's. Oh, you know, if she can lose that label, you know, Black woman writer, as if Morrison was trying to do that, or yeah. So thank you for that. And when you chose the name Son of Baldwin years ago for your community, your online, what did it mean to you then, and has that meaning changed over time?
What it meant to me then was I was answering a call. I watched a documentary about James Baldwin, and he said to his brother some of his final words. He was on his deathbed when he said this: "I hope that someone finds me in the wreckage." And this was about 2000, 2006, 2007. And I said, why haven't we found him in the wreckage? Because at that time, Baldwin had not experienced the renaissance that he's experiencing now, with everybody quoting him and finding his work and all this other stuff. And so I said, I want to start a community or a blog where we talk about, in Baldwin's name, all the things that he talked about: race and sexuality and politics and whiteness and all of this. So I started Son of Baldwin in his honor, as an homage to him. And so that it stuck very closely to all of the things that Baldwin represented. But in time, as the community grew, it started to take in some other things, because Baldwin had some things that he missed. Like, a lot of Baldwin's work veers into sexism, misogynistic territory. It's not until later on, closer to when he dies, that he's like, I get it now about how I regarded Black women. Because Nikki Giovanni and Audre Lorde had to get
him right up.
Had to get him right together. So but I like that he had that flaw, because with our icons, we have to realize they're also human. So you take the good and you learn from the bad, and then you try to do better, because I have my areas where I can do better, and the person who comes up after me will look at my work, hopefully, and say, this is what I found to be good, this is what I found to be bad, here's how I'm going to do better. And I think that is how the evolution works. So Son of Baldwin now is so much bigger than just relating to Baldwin, because I now talk to Black transgender women who live in South Africa, or Black lesbians who live in Zimbabwe, who give me a broader perspective of race and gender and sexuality and gender identity than my Western education has ever given me. And so it just grew. And I'm thankful for that, very much so.
So I want to leave time, thank you, for other people to ask you questions. I'm trying not to be selfish. My last question for you is this. One thing I learned about myself in this pandemic is
that I'm okay with being inside. My husband is very much, he cannot be, he had to go for walks, he had to do something to get out of the house. I was very okay with being inside with a book like this one here, reading, imagining myself in other places while being under my covers, or watching a really good movie, like watching The Color Purple and crying and crying at the same parts over and over again. Or writing. I think writers are very often solitary, and maybe that prepared me in some ways for being okay with being away from society in that way. And I did not know that about myself until the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna poke around a little bit and see if I can see the questions.
Okay.
Because I'm on my phone and it's a little different when you're on your phone. Let me see if I can find them. Let's see here.
Deesha, if you need help,
Here
just
we
let me
go.
know.
Yes, I do. Where can I find the questions or the chat? Like I can't see the chat. I can see myself and I can see Robert.
You could click where it says ask a question and the box should pop up. Do you see that?
See, I don't
I
see.
think it's because of the phone.
Nope.
Yep. So do you mind if I
Yeah.
pop in and moderate them?
Go ahead. Sure.
Okay. Let's see what we
Thank
have.
you.
We got a bunch of questions. Okay. We'll start with one that says, this isn't a deep question, but I just wanted to know if you kept the random shackles you found that partially inspired the story around throughout the process. I'm interested in what kind of space they occupied once you got started.
I do have them. I don't know where they are because you guys can't see this because I covered it up with like pretty blankets and stuff. But under this thing here are boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff that I took out of my mom's house. So they're in here somewhere. I just have to find them. But the space that they took up when I found them was that they just helped me focus, kind of like a talisman. They helped me visualize particular characters that I was writing about in this book. It helped me remember what it must have felt like to be them. And so when I wrote, I could, convey that in what I was writing.
Okay. Do you have any nonfiction?
So actually, I have the questions now.
You got it? Perfect. For it.
Yes, I just opened a different device and muted it. Okay. So let's see here. Let's shout out to our friends. Our Bookstagrammer friends are here, Robert.
Listen,
they are here in
shout out
force.
to Bookstagrammers who are the best. Oh my God, the work that they do is so invaluable. Thank you to all the Bookstagrammers, especially the Black Bookstagrammers. No shade.
Yes. Okay, so we have a question about, let's see, sorry, a lot of scrolling here. Thank you guys for all these compliments. Okay, so it looks like some of the questions just disappeared. Maybe it's scrolling too much, or like I'm not able to go back and find them. I know I saw one. Let's see. There was a question that I saw about your writing practice and process. Like, do you have a discipline, like daily?
No, I don't have like a specific ritual that I do where, some writers say I'm committed to staying in front of the computer and writing for X amount of hours per day. I don't have that. I have a thing where I have to be inspired to write, and that can be anytime. So I could be on the train on the way to work. I could be on a walk in a park, and then I pull out the phone and I just start. It could be 3 o'clock in the morning, which is how I got a lot of the profits done, by getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and writing until sun up, taking a quick nap, and then getting up to go to work. So my process is writing whenever and wherever I can, particularly when I am inspired.
Okay. And I'm happy to hear that, because I'm somebody that I'm raggedy when it comes to discipline. but in the pandemic, I too started getting up early in the morning. And that has made a lot of difference too. Let's see here. There's a lot of love here. Am I missing questions? Because I'm seeing a lot of love.
Oh, because there's a comment section, and then there's a question and answers section, which is separate.
Okay, gotcha. I see. That's why. All right. Well, let's see. Christina, you can grab the questions. I was just looking in the comments.
Okay, here we go. So, Mr. Jones Jr., do you regard fiction as a vector for politics of anti-racism, anti-homophobia at all? And if so, what are the resources unique to fiction versus organizing, direct action, political participation, etc., which might make it just as vital?
Woo! That is a great question. Yes, I don't think, I think writing and politics are like this. There's no non-political writing. I don't think there's any such thing. So yes, I do think fiction is a vector for activism. As Toni Morrison said, fiction is not fact, but it is truth. And truth is sometimes more important than fact, because it, especially if you can tell it in story form, because human beings are so susceptible to stories, as we have seen. So we really need we really need fiction in order to get at some truths that maybe direct on the streets activism doesn't. Direct on the street activism is the front line. And my hats off to all of my siblings out there on the front line doing that work, because that is difficult and dangerous work. And they're putting their very well-being and bodies on the line. And I bow down to that. But as Baldwin would say, somebody has to tell the story. Otherwise, they will be forgotten and their sacrifices will be forgotten. And that is the job of the artist. So whether you're painting or writing or singing or dancing, that is why you're doing it, at least in Black communities. That is why we're doing it. So, yes.
So here's a question for both of you. How do you create solo space for deep writing, thinking, processing with interacting with community and family? Like when you really want to get deep into it and yet you're this interconnected human?
For me, I don't have any children. It's just me and my husband that live in this place. My husband is very busy and he likes his space at times. And he knows that when I'm writing, I need my space. So when I'm in it, I disconnect from everything. I take hiatus from Son of Baldwin. I don't go on social media. I let all my friends and family know, listen, I'm going to be incognito for a moment. I'm okay. I'll reach out to you when I can. But right now I have to give myself over to the work. And for the most part, with the exception of my mother, who's like, I don't care. I want to talk to you when I want to talk to you. Everyone respects that. And I give my mother that, because I'm her son. I can't just like not let her know that I'm not doing okay. So, but otherwise it's just my space. And and everyone respects it. How about you, Deesha?
The opposite. So I have kids, but my kids are now 17 and 22. But I tell people, it doesn't mean it's necessarily easier being a parent. It's different. It's just different. They are more self-sufficient. They're not underfoot or anything like that. But there's still times when things come up with my kids that are so inconvenient. And, when I'm trying to get other things done. But because my writing career is as old as my oldest child, I've always had to figure out a way to do a combination of that dedicated time to myself, usually out of the house, right? In my house with kids in it, I could not really find a quiet place except maybe late at night, early in the morning. But also learning to write in the midst of things going on. So I did do that, a combination of those two things. And as far as, the community aspect of it, because especially in this pandemic, I am alone. And so community is how, I get my company. Like, I've had one friend in my house since March, just one person other than, my children. So it's striking that balance of staying connected to other people, but then also setting aside time to get that work done. And I'm part of multiple communities of writers where in this pandemic, we have been alone together. And that could be having a dedicated writing time where we connect virtually, chit chat, then mute, and everybody's working. So I've done some of that. And then sometimes it is just me writing by myself with just some music on or something. But I've had to be adaptable over these last 20 years because it's very hard to make plans when you have kids. And so I had to kind of write around that.
Like Toni Morrison talks about that, how her son spit up on her notepad and she wrote around the spit up.
Incredible. So, I love that image. I love it.
Yeah. But it also makes you, make good, wise use of your time. When it can be taken or disrupted at any time, that when you do have it, you make the most of it. And I don't say this to brag, but when people ask me about writer's block, I'm like, if I get the time, I'm writing something. I'm writing something.
So can we ask you both what you're reading now?
I just finished this Deesha's book. Everyone says that their favorite story is Peach Cobbler, because I think that's the richest one, the one that could, like, to me, be a movie or like be its own novel. But I have to say that I am partial to Eula. And the reason why I'm partial to Eula, and I've told Deesha this, is that it is the story of my cousin Priscilla, who passed on a couple of years ago, who could never live her life out loud because of the confines of the Christian church. So no one said out loud in my whole family that Priscilla was a lesbian. And when her lovers came around, they'd be like, oh, that's her friend. And so that did a disservice to me as a burgeoning queer person, because if I had known when I was a kid that my big cousin Scylla, was a lesbian, it would have made my path that much more easier, because I wouldn't have thought that I was so alone. So for me, Eula is testimony for so many women, but in particular my late cousin Priscilla. And so I honor that. And that this book feels like it feels like a sermon in so many ways. I love this book. So this is what I just finished reading. And before that, it was Maisie Card's These Ghosts Are Family, which is also a very brilliant book.
So I'm just getting into Black Futures, but the one I just finished, and I don't have them handy, is called Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue. It is a history of barbecue and Black folks. Wow. By Adrian Miller. He's the soul food scholar on Twitter. This is his third book. His first book was about the history of soul food. The second book was about a history of the people who have cooked for the presidents, from George Washington to Obama. And now this book. It is, if you're a barbecue lover, you're going to love it because it's got recipes and it's got profiles of pit masters. If you're a history buff, you're going to love it. He starts with the 1500s, and because barbecue is originate with indigenous folks and their methods of preparing whole animals on spits. And he
Oh.
traces the evolution from that to how did it come to be associated with Black folks. And then now he's looking at the commercialization of barbecue and how Black people are being marginalized now, even in that. And his book is an attempt to bring us back to the center.
Wow.
So we're coming up on an hour, but there's one more question here that we're going to do this one because it's really interesting. So because of your offering, you are now, no pun intended, viewed as a prophet to many a reader. So what kind of impact has that had on you?
I hear that, but I can't receive it. And the reason why I can't receive it is because I know myself as just flawed Robert. And as a writer in isolation, I don't really get to know what impact this is really having on people, how they're receiving it, what they're thinking about it. And I consider Toni Morrison a prophet. I consider James Baldwin and Gloria Naylor and Alice Walker and Octavia Butler and Zora Neale Hurston and Wallace Thurman prophets. I'm not there yet, if I'm ever going to even get there. So while I thank you for that compliment, I just have so much more work to do. So I can't yet, I feel like I can't receive it, but thank you.
Okay. So
can you receive that you are a vessel, that people, that our ancestors are working through you?
That I can receive, because many times while writing this book, I felt like a conduit, like it wasn't me, it was the ancestors speaking through me. So that I can receive, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm in awe of both of you. Again, I don't have the words to say how, how much both of your books have meant to me. So I just want to thank you for being with us tonight. And on behalf of Books and Books, if we were at the bookstore, I'd be asking you to sign my galley that I'm going to keep forever. Yeah. Because we're not, we'll just have to wait. But I do want to remind everyone that you can order the copy of the book. And actually, we have these beautiful book plates that Robert has signed. Thank you for showing those. And they come with each book. So now is the time.
Shout out to the Putnam art team, because they are the bomb.
Amazing. They did I actually was there when you did Book Expo, the editors panel, and they revealed the cover and you started crying. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. And
that cake that somebody recreated it as a cake. Oh my gosh.
That was fantastic.
So I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight, and stay safe. And I can't wait to see everybody in person someday soon. Thank you for being with us again and again. Thank you for your writing. Thank you for your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Books and
Thank
Books.
you.
Thank you, Deesha. I love you so much. Thank you for doing this.
I love you too. Oh, this was my pleasure. Thank you. Talk to you later. Bye everybody.